Afternoon and welcome to the Special Education Funding Task Force meeting. We have a busy agenda today, and so I want to take a moment before we move further to welcome everyone and also to have committee and staff introductions. So we'll actually start with Monica, if you'll introduce yourself and where you are coming from or representing.
Yes, I'm Monica Ross, and I am representing Part C of the infant toddler programs across Kansas, and I work for Infant Toddler Services of Johnson County.
I'm Amy Heisler. I'm the Director of Special Education in Holton, representing KC, the Kansas Association of Special Education Administrators.
I'm Kathy Kirstenbrock-Osmeyer. I'm Director of Special Ed at the Northwest Kansas Educational Service Center. I do both the Tiny K Infant Toddler Program and 3 to 21 Special Education.
I'm Melanie Haas. I'm the chair of the State Board of Education, and I'm also the parent of 2 special ed students in Shawnee Mission.
Good afternoon, Representative Valdenia Nguyen, K-12 ranking, and I am the Minority Leaders appointee.
And good afternoon, I am Representative Christy Williams, and I currently chair the K-12 Education Budget Committee.
Happy 2024 to everyone. I'm Molly Baumgardner. I'm Senator from the 37th Senate District, and I'm Chair of Senate Education.
Hello, everyone. Representative Adam Thomas. I am the Chair of the Education Policy Committee on the House side and represent District 26, which is South Olathe and Spring Hill.
Good afternoon. Renee Erickson, Senate District 30. I am the Vice Chair of the Senate Education Committee.
Good afternoon. Brent Yeager, Proud Superintendent of Olathe Public Schools, USD 233.
And staff. Nick, you want to start?
Thank you. My name is Nick Myers. I'm with the Office of Reviser of Statutes.
Tamara Lawrence. I'm also with the Office of Reviser of Statutes.
Matthew Willis. I am an education research analyst with Legislative Research.
Jennifer Light. I'm the K-12 budget analyst for the Kansas Legislative Research Department.
I'm Cindy Rexer. I am Senator Baumgardner's office assistant and the committee assistant for Senate Education.
My name is Anthony Valencia. I'm from the AV Tech.
And my name is Carter Montgomery, and I'm also an AV Tech.
All right, welcome. Good to see so many people come out on a very cold and snowy day. Before we move to nomination for our leadership election, I will say that the committee received notice on some documents, LOB Special Education, excess cost explainer memo, as well as an unencumbered funds for special education. So you should have those received by email. All right, before we move to testimony or in whatever manner the new chair so desires, I'll open it up for nominations. Representative Nguyen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to nominate Melanie Haas for chair.
All right, we have Melanie Haas for chair and for a second.
Kathy Kirstenbrock-Osmeyer. I'll second that.
All right, and a second. Any further discussion? Any other nominations? All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, so we have Melanie Haas. You are welcome to take the chair.
Madam Chair, do we need a vice chair?
Yes, we do. Are there any nominations for vice chair?
Kathy Kirstenbrock-Osmeyer. I nominate Valdenia Nguyen, vice chair.
Do we have a second?
Amy Heisler. I'll second.
Thank you. Are there any other nominations? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. Thank you. Representative Nguyen.
Vice Chair Nguyen. All right, let me get situated here. Give me just a moment. I'd like to kind of set the tone for why we're here. So as a reminder, the legislature wanted to dig into the funding formula for special education, to do a deeper dive. And so a law was passed creating this task force and asking us to essentially brave our first big Kansas snowstorm of the year, right? And dig into answering some of the questions that I think we've heard over the years in committees and special committees, but not really been able to arrive at consensus on. So today we are charged, this task force is charged with sending a report to the legislature in about 10 days. So that's the task that we're really laser focused on today. We each have an agenda. We've got a list of speakers that I think most are in the room. I think we've got a couple on Zoom, is that right? Okay, and that's the short list, oops, that I have here. Okay. And a few, okay. So we will navigate that and the snow. But I think that the discussion today is really about recommendations and next steps. Everyone introduced themselves, and it's clear that we've got some experts in the room, and later I'm going to look to you all as a body to help decide what those recommendations to the legislature should be. So in my time on the state board, we have attempted to work across the street with the legislature, and I will admit that we haven't been great at that. We've had some beginning meetings that then faltered, and so I think, you know, maybe part of that is perceived turf or the need to stay in our own lane, whether it be the state board or the legislature, and we just haven't collaborated in the way that at least I know I personally have always hoped that we could. So hopefully this can be the beginning of some of that. It doesn't help that our schedules are often in conflict with each other as well. If you're not familiar with the current makeup of the state board, I just want to give a little background. Let me say that it's quite diverse. We had new board members come on at the beginning of 2023. There are 10 members on the state board from all across Kansas, and they don't always vote together. If you were to watch a board meeting, you might not be able to pick, that's a Democrat, that's a Republican. I'm hoping that this can also be a very bipartisan effort to really focus on special education students in Kansas, special education teachers in Kansas, and all of the families that are impacted by these services and work. I'm pretty sure that to a person, the state board would agree that there's a lot of room for improvement. And as the chair of the state board, I think a lot of people believe that I come to my position with the idea and certainly portraying Kansas schools as being potentially perfect. Nobody's perfect. Our schools aren't perfect. There's a lot of room for improvement, and I've heard that. I went back and re-listened to all of the testimony from the special committee in the fall. I watch the legislative meetings from YouTube. Very thankful to have that option. And so if we can come to an agreement on how to best fund special education in Kansas, I think that that's really our goal today. We have, the state board recommended back in the summer on a 10-0, a unanimous vote, these people who rarely all agree on the same thing, they did agree that within 4 years we needed to fully fund special education. I think that that's an important note to bring forward as I represent the board today. They recommended that phasing the funding to a full funding at 92% over the next 4 years. This is also a chance for us to prepare for 2027 when the school finance law expires. And so I think that this is the beginning of a conversation. It's not just that schools want more money. There's a lot of frustration on the different sides of this issue. So I'm asking you task force members to set aside the fact that SPED is underfunded. Bring your expertise today, and let's talk about the alternatives. What are our other options? Where can we find common ground? Not every school gets 69% or whatever the percentage may be in a given year. How do we make that more equitable? How do other states do it? That's a question that I'd really like to get an answer to. And it's probably not an answer that can come from this body today. What data do we need to have a deeper conversation? What else do you want to know, and how can we go forward? The Dyslexia Task Force met for 3 full days the first year that they were together, and then had continuing meetings. I served on a graduation task force that met as a large group. There were 20-ish people in that group who then broke out into smaller subcommittees and divided up some of the work that way. So again, I think this is an opportunity to do more and really get in the weeds before offering some additional recommendations back to the task force and then ultimately to the legislature. So let's set our table for a nice long meal, if you will. Bring our best selves and have a nice long dinner. Let's be respectful and refrain from personal attacks and questions that turn into speeches. So we have before us an opportunity to finally work together to figure this out. And it probably doesn't happen all today, especially since some of us want to get home in the weather. So before we get to the list of conferees, I think that it would be good to try to get on the same page. I know that we're scheduled to start with testimony, but if someone from KSDE would be willing to give a brief overview of SPED funding. There was a presentation that was given to the State Board in December. I think it might be good to kind of get all of the members of the task force on the same page. And I'm looking to see who all, I don't know where everyone landed from KSDE. Senator Baumgartner, did you have a question?
I don't have a question, but I do have a brief comment. I think that part of your request was that we could get on the same page and work together. And I think in light of that, I think it's important for us as a task force to acknowledge that there are guidelines that we are to be following, and that would be the Open Meetings Act, COMA. And I think some of what we're seeing, in fact, right now, is that COMA includes not just emails to the entire group and agreements being made on emails, but it does include serial phone calls and polling of committee members. And I think that that has occurred with this task force before we even had our first meeting. And so I am going to, since as a senator in my 9 years, I have been author or co-author of 2 updates to COMA. And if we are going to have a relationship as a task force of trust and working together, then I think we need to start by following the law, and that would be the Kansas Open Meetings laws. Thank you.
So I'll just address the elephant in the room. This task force wasn't called, and the reason for that was understood to be that Chair Williams wouldn't have the votes and wouldn't be chair.
The task force meeting was called. It's called today. It was called for today.
But previously it was called by a majority of the members of the task force who wanted to meet. So I would like to rebut your suggestion that the Open Meetings Act was violated. It was not. Walking in here today, I had never talked to several of these people, and I hear you on the serial calls, and that is not what occurred.
I'm not saying that you made the serial calls. I'm not saying that you made serial emails, but when a group gets together and gets an agreement by polling different members, and some were included and some were excluded, that is a demonstration of that violation. Now, a meeting was called by the chairman. That meeting is today. The email that we received several months ago by signatures didn't go out to all committee members, and it was calling for a meeting within a 48-hour time period. So I am simply saying, we are here today. We have an agenda. We have a list of testimony, which I look forward to. But as we move forward, I think it's important that we will follow COMA.
I agree. Thank you, Senator Baumgartner. KSDE, would it be possible to get, welcome John Hess.
Madam Chair, members of the task force, my name is John Hess. I'm the Director of Fiscal Services and Operations for the Kansas State Department of Education, and I presented in December a
in conjunction with several of my colleagues, a history and overview of special education to the state board. So that is what is before you, and so my goal is to not spend much time on this and is to get through it as fast as possible. As always, if there are any questions about special education funding or any school funding, KSDE is happy to address those questions. I would just note, starting on slide 3 of this, page 3 of this handout, that the Kansas law governing special education was passed in 1974. Since that time, state aid has been authorized to help pay for special education services. It has always been as a form of reimbursement primarily for teacher salaries. There's been some other reimbursements such as for transportation, but that has been the primary vehicle for state aid to school districts. Moving on to the next slide, there is in the by the 1990s, the informal policy goal, the excess cost percentage was not put into statute until 2005. So during the 90s, there was a informal policy goal to fund 92%, but this wasn't put in statute. It was just an informal goal used by the legislature, the state board, and the governor to determine the special ed funding appropriation for the year. And based on our records, state aid ranged from 77% to 95% during that decade. I would note that it was during the 90s that catastrophic aid was added for special education, so that which is for exceptionally high cost special education students. Moving on, the next, it was in response to the Montoy lawsuit in the 2005 special session that the stair step to 92% of excess cost was put into state law. The stair step would be in the 05-06 school year. It would be 89.3% of excess costs, and then 06-07 and thereafter 92% of excess costs. So the next two slides are some historical data going back to 2009. The first one shows the state aid, supplemental federal aid. So this was ARA money back in the Great Recession, and then this is ESSER money and other COVID relief monies in the recent years allocated towards special education. So this is above and beyond the normal federal IDEA grants to the state of Kansas, and then the percent of excess costs covered by it. So there's some historical data there. Moving on to the next slide, that is where we compared the total SPED aid, so including any of that supplemental federal funding, and total SPED expenditures, and just tracked them over time and showed state aid as a percent of total SPED expenditures since fiscal year 2009. From fiscal year 2009 to fiscal year 2023, SPED state aid increased by 27.3%, while total SPED expenditures increased by 44.5%. Moving on to slide 9, that's just a brief overview of the excess cost calculation, which is found in KSA 3422. And the general gist of it is the excess costs equals the total cost of providing SPED services minus the cost of regular education for special education students minus federal aid for special education. So you can see on the next slide a visualization of that. All three of those bars together, blue, gold, and green, are total expenditures out of the SPED fund. You subtract out the cost of regular ed for SPED students, and you subtract out federal IDEA grants and federal Medicaid grants. And the remaining amount, the blue, is the excess cost percentage according to statute. So state aid is then distributed in 4 ways. The first is catastrophic state aid, which, as I mentioned before, is for particularly high-cost students. The second is Medicaid replacement state aid, which is capped at $9 million a year and based on the number of Medicaid students and special education students approved for Medicaid services in a given district. The third is transportation state aid, which is reimbursed at 80% of actual costs for transportation for teachers or students, but for students, those transportation services have to be in the IEP. And then the balance of it is distributed as special education, teacher state aid, categorical aid. There's a variety of names for it, but that is distributed as aid as per FTE teacher. So the balance is then divided by the total FTE of SPED teachers in the state, and that comes up with a dollar amount that is distributed per FTE. Certified teachers count as 1.0 if they are a full-time SPED student or SPED teacher. Paraprofessionals count as 0.4 FTE, which is in accordance with state law. So the next slide goes over some of the current special education estimates. And then I would move on to slide 14, which is, so as I mentioned before, SPED aid has gone up, but the percent of excess cost has been going down. And so that's primarily because there are more SPED students in the state. And as there are an increase of SPED students, there are more need for staff to provide special education services, and the vast majority of special education costs are tied up in personnel. So as there are more students, there's a greater demand for staff to provide those services, which increases costs over time. So I would note that then on slide 16, so the result of this is, of course, special education services have to be provided in accordance with state and federal law. So if the state appropriation does not equal the amount that's outlined in statute, school districts have to make up the difference by transferring monies from their general funds and their local option budgets. And so on slide 16, that just shows some historical data from fiscal year 2019 through 23 about how much money school districts are transferring from various funds into the special education fund. So those are transfers from the general fund, from LOBs, and a few from the contingency reserves into the special education fund. That is above for the general fund. That is above and beyond what they are already required to transfer, which is the amount of special education state aid they receive, which is deposited in the general fund and then moved to the special education fund. The so the state board, as Chair Haas indicated, adopted a 4-year plan to get to 92%. There's an amended version of it on page 17, which is based on the most recent consensus estimates between KLRD, the Division of Budget, and KSDE. And then beginning on page 19, there is just a few brief overviews of different ways states fund special education. I'm not going to go through all of them, but the gist of it is that there are 51 states plus DC. There are almost 51 ways that states fund special education. There's a wide variety, whether individual models like reimbursement, what Kansas does, or multiple student weighting, single student weighting. There's some states that just use one, but then there's 25 abouts that use a combination of various methods. So that is a very quick overview of what I presented to the state board back in December, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hess. Task force members, are there any questions for John Hess before we move on to the conferees? Okay, seeing none, thank you. We will go first to Leah Fleiter. Oh. Thank you. Yes, let me set some expectations there as far as presentations. I'm gonna limit each speaker to 3 minutes. I know that's short, but we have your written testimonies. So if we can just go through and kind of knock these out in 3 minutes and maybe really focus on what are new things that the task force needs to hear. Where can we find some common ground? What problems do we have to solve? So I'll let you start. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon. And on behalf of the Kansas Association of School Boards, I'd like to thank the task force for meeting today and for your willingness to listen thoughtfully to the knowledgeable and dedicated public school advocates who will follow me on today's agenda. KSB is a nonprofit service organization built on an abiding belief in Kansas public schools. We have put the needs of students and K-12 leaders first since 1917. We serve roughly 3,000 locally elected school board members, the largest body of elected officials in our state, through legislative advocacy, legal services, leadership training, and risk management services. I was honored to serve for 8 years on my local Board of Education, Manhattan-Ogden USD 383. In addition, many of our dedicated KSB staff are also former or current school board members, superintendents, or school building leaders. We're proud to work every day in communities across Kansas to lead, serve, and advocate for public schools and the nearly 500,000 Kansas children we educate. Great things are happening in Kansas public schools, but one of the biggest challenges our districts face in supporting student achievement is chronic underfunding of special education at the federal and state levels. Kansas public schools are proud to work with families to ensure that students with IEPs get the education they're entitled to by law. If Congress and the state legislature don't keep their promises to reimburse our schools for the additional costs of educating students with disabilities and gifted students, all Kansas students suffer. The state legislature and the members of this task force in their various professional roles have grappled with the tension between federal and state IDEA funding for several years now. Thank you all for your dedication and for your willingness to press the Kansas congressional delegation to hold the federal government accountable for its share of special education funding. I've personally visited the Hill to urge full funding of IDEA since 2016, and I'm leading a delegation of about a dozen Kansas school board members, including actually Representative Nguyen, at the end of this month to continue that fight for full federal funding of IDEA. So we respectfully ask the legislature to be our partner in this noble effort. Kansans want their public schools to provide special education to students with disabilities and gifted students. They pay their taxes to provide these services. Today, we ask the legislature, which has the power of the purse, to allocate those funds. There's widespread political support for this action, especially at a time of record budget surpluses. We conducted a listening tour over the summer of approximately 200 local education leaders representing more than 100 school districts. And as you may know, our school board members in Kansas hold a wide variety of political views, and they told us fully funding special education at 92% of excess costs is a top policy priority for them this year. Our locally elected boards of education respectfully and urgently request that the Kansas legislature do its part to help us improve student achievement for all Kansas students by fulfilling its promise to pay for 92% of the excess costs we bear after federal reimbursement. We pledge to continue our efforts at the federal level as well, and we're honored to be working with the task force in the future if that opportunity should present itself. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker will be Dave Trabert.
Good morning, or good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. My name is Dave Trabert. I'm CEO of Kansas Policy Institute. We do a lot of research on education issues, and we also have a subsidiary that represents local school board members. I want to start by clarifying a statement. I know that the general consensus is that special education funding is underfunded, but that is with the caveat that if you look at the legislation as written, what we've outlined in our testimony shows that the legislation does not count all of the money that's attributed to special education by the state. And if it is all counted, then special education is overfunded. And that's one of the things I want to talk to you about today. Certainly, I understand, we heard the amount of funding that local districts transfer, but that doesn't seem to mean that services are being withheld as a result of those transfers. And that's what the focus should be on, not the money, but the services. If you look at the cash balance increases, and I won't go through the numbers, it's all in my testimony. Cash balance, cash reserves for special education and all other operating costs have increased significantly over the years. Now, there's only 3 possible explanations for those increases. One is that districts used the state and local money to increase reserves while they withheld services. I don't think that's the case. Another is they withheld services and didn't know that they could use their cash reserves to provide the services. I don't think that's the case either. The third one is that they provided the services that they thought were needed, and they still had money left over to increase cash reserves. That's what we think this really comes down to. They're holding a lot more reserves than necessary. That's in my testimony. We would suggest that you fix the formula that distributes the money, because as was mentioned, some districts, 135 districts actually got more than 92% last school year. Fix it so that no district gets more than 92%, because excess going to one district is at the expense of others. We'd also suggest that you fix the formula so that all of the money related to special education is counted. The formula counts some weightings, but not all. The formula counts some LOB, but not all. And in a conversation with Craig Neuenswander last year at the Department of Education, with legislators in attendance, he said, I don't know why. That's a good question. We just don't know why. So if you can find that legislative intent of why some was left out, then we'd like to see the intent documentation. We'd also like to know if services are being withheld, if districts can document what services they aren't providing because of the funding, because they have the money to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Marvin Miller, I believe that he is remote. Is that right?
Yes. Hello.
Hello. We can hear you, though we can't see you. But unless you have a slide deck, go right ahead. There you are.
Okay. Very
Welcome.
Good. Well, thank you. My name is Marvin Miller, and I serve this year as chair of SEAC, the Special Education Advisory Council. For some of you that may not know, it's an IDEA federally mandated committee comprised of a range of individuals, not all educators, representing a wide variety of interests across the state, but we have a majority requirement in common. We are parents of or persons of someone with a disability. When I was appointed 10 years ago, I was pastoring a church in Wellington, Kansas. And since then, I've received my special ed secondary teaching degree. And for the last 5 years, I've taught in categorical structured learning secondary classroom, working with students across the autism spectrum. But I also come to this as a parent, as I said. And since she has been in the Kansas school system, special ed has not been fully funded. I chose to serve on SEAC because I know that disability crosses all racial, ethnic, gender, and and political lines. I had a little glitch here, sorry. I'm sorry. Okay. Let me continue. The issues I see affect all of our students. And what I've discovered as I've examined things and as SEAC has looked at things is that every transition task force that I've taken part in and every study that I've read in CEC or AAIDD journals points to a way of moving forward so we have seamless funding across the lifespan. And it starts in our K through 12 and even our Tiny Tots special education. The district that I worked for the last number of years has transferred $6.5 million just in 2022-23 school year out of their general fund and millions of dollars before that. And yes, I will tell you, every student that I teach, and my daughter as well, has received every service and need that they needed to have. But it's at the bargain, no frills basement, because simply the district cannot pay anything more because they have limited funds to them supplied by the state. So yes, even with the money transfers that are going on, there is still a direct effect in special education classrooms. But the worst impact, I do believe, is actually in the general education setting, because special education students are general education students as well. My inclusion students, just like the rest of the students, do not receive the same quality of instruction when they are put in a class of 30 or 35 that they would have had at 20. Specialized tech classes, career pathway classes, and other electives that might have been offered to our general student population are eliminated because there are not enough funds to hire those teachers, as funds are going directly to special ed. Which means my inclusion students who wanted a specialized or a career elective are not able to take them anymore as well. These funding cuts do hurt their future integrated competitive employment dreams too, and unfortunately, unlike some of their peers, they will not be able to bounce back and switch paths as easily. I've had people tell me that the solution is to cut costs of support and related services.
Dr. Miller, we'll ask you to wrap it up. You're at 3 minutes.
Okay. In a typical day, my students may need a para for toileting, an OT, a PT, a VI, a computer assistive technology, ASL, TOD, SLP, Spanish-speaking interpreter, a nurse, a social worker, mental health. These are harder to find. I'm just asking that people realize that we need to fully fund, no matter what the percent is, we need to fully fund for every student. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker will be Monica Brown.
Good afternoon, and I'm going to be scattered. I thought I had 5 minutes, so I was panic editing, sorry. My name is Monica Brown. I'm a low-incidence special education teacher in the Gardner-Edgerton District. Proud to do it. And I just want to start by saying anybody who's advocating for any kind of budget reductions or no increase needs to do what I do. You need to come and do what I do with the budget that I have. I'm going to go ahead and invite you virtually into my classroom for a day, quickly. And caveat it with, I'm at a great school. I have resources. I have a fantastic collaborative team. I have administration that backs me, and I'm still tired. Morning starting with a para calling in, statewide sub shortage. We don't staff for absences because we don't have enough funding for that. We couldn't anyway, even if we wanted to, because there's a statewide para shortage. Recruiting and retaining quality staff requires funding. We change diapers, we use gloves, we use wipes, we have multi-$1,000 tablets with communication devices so my children, my students, have a voice. We have equipment in the multiple thousands of dollars that we take with us so our students can move in the schools. We gather all those materials and so that we can implement a legally required individualized education plan. Individualization requires funding. Related services. We're currently facing a statewide shortage of professional related service providers who are willing to do the work required for the pay offered in Kansas schools because of a lack of state funding. Going back to our paras, after being told last week in a training that they would be considered first responders in an active shooter situation, let's consider that for a moment. They get dragged through it almost every single day, and they do it because they love the kids. But para pay statewide is a disgrace. There is no funding for it. Respectable salaries require funding. I've watched our teachers, paras, related service providers continually do more with less with our most complex, high-needs community to be guilted by those setting these abhorrently low funding percentages into being okay with it, because if we ask for more appropriate funding, we must not be in it for the kids. Trite rhetoric when it perpetuates an expectation for us to get second jobs and donate to our profession as if it were a charity because of the gaps left by those who refuse to fully fund special education. These students, we educators, are people deserving of dignity, respect, and resources. When we fight a segregation narrative, when we include everyone and meet the needs of all those we claim to want to support, everyone benefits, but individualization and inclusion require funding. Best practice takes investment and sacrifice from our state budget. I understand that. It also took sacrifice and investment for me and my family for going to grad school for 4 years. It does every day when I donate to my classroom. When legislators in 2024 choose not to invest, decide that our most vulnerable population, those who have to fight daily to get leftovers, are worth closed-minded budget decisions when they expect caviar but pay for a can of tuna, the beautiful things still happen. Not
Brown.
because of the grossly underfunded budget set by those who sit comfortably behind desks that have no educational purposes, but because we have personal teacher contracts. We figure it out, but I need you to know, we cannot pour from an empty cup. You control the pitcher. We're doing our jobs for the kids. We expect you to do yours. Thank you.
Next up is David Westbrook. Is David here? We're going to wait just a minute. Not online? Okay. If he shows up, we can add him to the end. Let's go to, is it Cassandra or Cassandra Signs?
Sandra.
Hello, on WebEx.
Hi.
Welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you for allowing me to speak. I am a parent of 2 children who had received special education services. My oldest just aged out at the end of last year. He is 21. And our school district was wonderful. And I know the services that they provided to him, especially for the last 5 years he was in school, was a great hardship to them. He was actually at a private residential school for individuals with autism the last 5 years he was in school. And I want to make sure that special education is fully funded, because when it is not, all kids suffer. When you have to provide the services that are included in an individual education plan, you have to do it. It is a federal mandate, and the schools could get in trouble. My husband and I know how fortunate we are that we lived in the district that we did, and we were able to get the services that we needed for our son. And he is now in a placement where he is thriving and where he needs to be. And we couldn't have gotten there without our school district, because they were so helpful. But I know that they, paid way above and beyond what they should have had to have paid, and had to utilize general education funds because of the lack of special education funding. And all the students have suffered because of that lack of funding. And that's not fair to all the students. And I have to fight for our school district and all of the other school districts in our state. We need to make sure. There is a problem in our state where we are always fighting as parents for funding for our individuals with disabilities, and it needs to stop. We're not asking for the world. We're just asking for our kids to have what they need. The IDD waiting list is horrendous, and we need to start with special education funding and get that fully taken care of so we can move on to the IDD waiting list and get that taken care of. Our kids matter, and we need you to understand that. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Timothy Graham. In the room, welcome.
Thank you. Tim Graham, KNEA. I want to start off, I'm going to talk pretty fast. I want to start off by just thanking you guys for the opportunity to testify. We complain a lot about not being at the table. It feels a little different now. At least we feel like we're in the room. We're not quite at the table yet, but we want to keep working on that with all of you across the political spectrum to make sure we're a good resource to you. If you'll also read about our organization in my testimony, I won't go into it, but I think what I want you to take away from that is to please understand that we get our marching orders from Kansas teachers. We get our marching order from our members, and they do that by a democratically elected process, and that's what guides our agenda. It's not an agenda that's told to us by any national organization or any one elected official that thinks that they have us by the tail. This is the voice of the teachers and our members. To that, we have several resolutions dealing with special education. They speak to all levels of government and bureaucracy. They either directly or indirectly appeal to local, state, and federal levels of government. This includes local school districts and boards, all three branches of state government, the Kansas Board of Education, the Kansas Department of Education, and the many committees, task force, agencies, councils, and other related entities that are involved in this process. Our resolution also speaks to all parties involved. We routinely look at the needs of the student's family, the educator, and the expectations of the community that relies on the public education system. Through our resolutions, you'll see that we have several resolutions that don't even speak directly to funding. You can read these resolutions in my testimony. However, most of these are related to appropriate funding at the end of the day. So you'll see at the end that appropriate funding resolution in our book of resolutions is probably the smallest resolution we have on special education, and that's because a lot of our members, is that 1 minute to go or 1 minute in? Don't worry about it. Please read my possible hurdles and pitfalls. We've been challenged to provide evidence-based solutions on the topic of special education funding. We respect that charge. However, this is increasingly difficult because the opposing sides of this issue, all sides of this issue, fail to agree to accept the same data. We've already heard that today. We don't agree on the same data. We don't agree on the numbers. And so how do you expect us to come up here and give you evidence-based solutions if you guys may or may not agree with the data we're using to give you those solutions? So I want you to think about that, please. And what's the answer to that? The answer is to talk to us. Let the practitioners tell you their stories. Let the practitioners tell you the stories of the real-world consequences that come from the decisions that are made in this building. So please, that's a challenge to all of you, not just one party. Not one party has all the answers. All of you, please accept us as a resource. Call on us. We want to help. We want to be a partner in this, and we will do our best to be a good partner if you allow us to. Thank you.
Thank you. Jonathan Eschnauer. And after Jonathan, we'll have Mary Sinclair. She's on WebEx.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Eschner. I'm a high school special education teacher in Olathe, and I went to work today for half a day, and it was exciting to see students back from break, connecting with some of my seniors that I had as freshmen and sophomores, and I showed them off my facial hair growth, and one student gave me the thumbs up, and he's grown so much, and I'm so proud of him, and I think that's the joy that we get from our jobs each and every day as special education teachers, that is hidden and not seen because it's hard to share those stories for privacy purposes. But it's become more and more difficult to be a special education teacher and a related service provider in Kansas. When I started, I had a caseload of 12. I'm now at 16, which that number is much smaller than others throughout the state. And that becomes a challenge of how do we meet those needs and guide those needs of the students through their individual plans, which are going to look dramatically different for each and every student. And so that is a challenge. And then the related service providers that we work and partner with to provide those. In a previous district that I worked in, we had to start going to telehealth for speech language pathology. That's a huge concern because that is best, as we've all learned, in-person learning is the best. And when we're having to supplement those services to out-of-state providers to telephone in to work with students, we're missing the mark. The other thing is paraprofessionals. My district, I looked right before we started this meeting or before submitting testimony, and we had 98 paraprofessional openings. These are professionals that in my district are paid $15 an hour, that are doing all the things. They're providing access to learning in the classroom. They're toileting students. They're providing de-escalation strategies for those students that don't know how any else to communicate their concerns other than to show physical aggression. And we're paying them $15 an hour. And Quick Trip down the road, I saw an ad, starting salary $18 an hour. That's part-time. And we're asking and comparing the same place that sells coffee and donuts or my Dr. Pepper if I'm treating myself. We're saying that that Dr. Pepper or that donut is more valuable than our students' access to learning. So I come from a family of educators. My mom's an educator, retired. My grandmother taught in a one-room schoolhouse near Alta Vista. This is something that I take on proudly, and I think if we work together, come to my classroom, come to my building, I know that we'll welcome you to see some of the challenges and opportunities that we face.
Thank you. I'm going to move some people around here because I just got a note. If we could skip to Dr. Rebecca Varvel, if you're in the room. And then we'll come back to Mary Sinclair.
Good afternoon, Task Force Committee members. My name is Rebecca Varvel, and I'm currently the Assistant Director of Special Ed for USD 453 Leavenworth Public Schools. I am also a parent of a child with a speech-language impairment. I'm a proud supporter of the special education programming we provide at USD 453, as we've experienced a variety of successes in our department. Some of these things include implementation of a multidisciplinary early childhood team that provides services to all students in our pre-K program, continued success with our students who attend our special day school for our most challenging behavior needs, and between 50 to 60% of those students average transition back to their home buildings. We've developed a robust training program for our paraprofessionals where every new staff member gets over 27 hours of new hire training before they're placed in a classroom. 45% of our students who are in our 18 to 21 program or have recently graduated that program are employed, whereas the national average is only 38%. And we have a variety of related service providers that are working to provide quality, life-changing equipment such as electric wheelchairs and AAC devices for our students. But despite our achievements, we face severe underfunding challenges, utilizing $2.7 million of our general budget to pay for special ed services that are required by state and federal law, but they're not fully funded. By spending our general dollars on special education, it makes it hard to keep and hire our best teachers and staff that we need for all students, as well as pursue creative measures to ensure success for all kids in our school district. This includes things like after-school programming, career and technical education opportunities, evidence-based interventions, and programming for students with challenging behaviors. But I want to bring your attention to two big challenges that we're currently facing that's also being faced across the state. There's a marked increase in the significance of behaviors that we see in our children with disabilities, as well as those that are not identified at all. At a young age, we have children entering our systems with mental health concerns that have significant impacts on a child's ability to function in the school system as well as at home. The population of these students require intensive programming with a low student-to-staff ratio, ideally no more than 5-to-1. With the increase in complex students' needs and a lack of trained individuals to provide those services, many districts have turned to private placements for those children. The availability of these programs lead to further complications, as many students are required to ride in buses and taxis for over an hour each day, and those programs cost an average of $250,000 per year per student that's sent. Second, the education system has witnessed a marked decrease in the number of staff who are willing and able to serve the most vulnerable population. Our district currently has 17 certified vacancies and 22 classified vacancies, and as such, we've been tasked with becoming creative with staffing, increasing wages, and oftentimes contracting those services out. Those contracted services cost increasingly more. For example, a virtual school psychologist costs $97 per hour, a BCBA $96 an hour, or just a high incidence teacher costs $69 an hour, whereas we could hire those people in-house and pay an average of $45, $46 per hour. My personal professional belief is that the state legislature should strive to fully fund special ed. Fully funded special ed is good for all Kansas students, and I want to emphasize that fully funding special ed is not just a moral imperative, it's an economic one. Investing in the education of all students, regardless of their abilities, will yield long-term benefits for our society as a whole. I urge you to view special ed funding not as an expense, but as an investment in the potential of every child in our state. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you. We'll go to Kellen Adams next.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I want to say thank you for your service to this committee as well as to the kids of Kansas. I am not going to restate what you have on my testimony, but rather try to emphasize a few points that I think are rather salient to the argument and the topic today. First, I do not believe that this formula is broken, and I want to emphasize that. It is not perfect, but I would continue to follow a model of reimbursement. I believe that is foundational and has been for a number of years here in Kansas. I have significant concerns if you were to shift to a model that follows the foundation aid currently under KSDE and would shift to weightings for pupils. So I want to really strongly emphasize that. Second, I probably don't align with all of my colleagues with this comment, but to be candid, I think that phasing in is probably what's best for our system. I say that because the ability to find staff is a real struggle. You just heard Dr. Varvel. We've got approximately 40 special ed openings. We have a total of 70 openings in USD 453, a system of about 3,500. So I'm operating on about 90% staff currently. Systems need time to respond. So the phasing in component, I would urge you to strongly consider. I think we need to acknowledge that this is a heavily personnel-based part of the district, and it is often the most difficult part of the district to staff. Anecdotally, I can tell you about autism classrooms in my district in which it is possible in which you may encounter feces throughout the day, and I apologize for getting graphic, but I want to tell you about the reality of serving in some of these very highly vulnerable classrooms. So please use caution when abandoning the current formula. I would urge you to first fully fund it before fully abandoning it for something else. Let's fund it fully and decide whether or not that works. And remember that we have already found many efficiencies in the state by way of the interlocal and cooperative systems that encompass the vast majority of our 286 school districts. Finally, you'll find the graphic that I gave you. I have 3 classifications in our district in an attempt to highlight the costs to the system. Classification 1 was the average para wages, clocking in at just under $30,000. The second classification, RBT, Registered Behavior Technician, clocking in at just over $40,000. And the third was an average teacher salary. As you're all well aware, there is categorical aid, currently averaging around $31,000. In each case, that falls just below, or if not significantly below, 50% of those personnel costs. Again, thank you for your time today, and again, thank you for your service.
Thank you. Judith Deedy is our next speaker, followed by Sherry Demeline.
Can you hear me?
There you are. Welcome.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. As a statewide grassroots group, we urge the task force to listen carefully to informed stakeholders. The funding and provision of SPED is complex, and we believe a task force such as this one is better equipped to handle the evaluation of these issues than a legislative committee. The agenda for today's hearing is extremely limited, so we hope the task force will continue its work. We've been advocating for public education for over a decade and have never seen an interim education committee or task force given just 2 hours of meeting time. We think there should be more roundtable discussions to address SPED funding. We offer a few points for your consideration. 1, special education services are being provided, but they could be provided better with additional funding, which would benefit all SPED students. 2, districts are using large amounts of general education funds to pay for unfunded SPED services. Increasing SPED funding would benefit all students. 3, SPED costs are rising and districts have no way to avoid the consequences of rising costs and lack of federal and state funding. Local districts don't have the option of not providing SPED, and they can't raise additional funds due to the cap on LOB. It's also important to note that the state has increased district SPED requirements. For example, the legislature recently added dyslexia to the definition of SPED. As costs rise, funding must also rise. For sped funding wasn't litigated during Gannon because the legislature was funding sped at about 92% when the case was filed. The fact that the court didn't address sped shouldn't be taken to mean it would be satisfied with the current sped funding situation. By asking the legislature to abide by its statutory commitment to fund sped at 92% isn't just asking for more money. No one is asking the state to fund beyond 92%. The increasing amount of funding requested isn't greed. It's an effort to provide the resources necessary to educate the children of Kansas. It is by definition linked to actual sped costs. 6, LOB funding derived from state sped funding is still local funding and should not count towards the calculation of the state's 92%. LOB funding was designed to allow districts to pay for extras not provided under the state formula. It was never meant to be mandated to use for sped funding, let alone be counted as the state's share. Additionally, under statute, local districts are already responsible for 8% of excess costs. The current calculation was the context for the 92% figure in statute. If we count the money differently, we should raise the 92% to a higher number. We believe the current formula isn't the problem, and we emphasize that any modifications still need to start with actual costs of providing sped. Over the years, we've heard some districts get more than their actual costs under the current formula. The formula could be amended to cap a district's funding at its actual costs without having to completely rewrite it. Thank you for your consideration of these and other concerns relating to the funding of sped in Kansas.
Thank you. Next up, we'll have Sherry Dumoulin and then Mary Sinclair.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and I appreciate you taking time away from your commitments regarding this very important topic. So my name is Sherry Dumoulin. I currently serve as the Chief of Special Education within the Shawnee Mission School District. I've served in education for 22 plus years, all of that time being served in special education. Today, I want to highlight a few additional areas that can be found in my written testimony, but I wanted to be able to emphasize them with you. So the impact for all students. We've heard that from many other speakers today. One, we continually have to pull money from general education dollars to fulfill special education obligations. That takes away from the greater of all students. I think it's important to note that special education students are general education students first. These students have the right to access all of the additional opportunities that we could create with those dollars that we're having to program specifically for special education. Districts have completed needs assessments in each of their buildings, identifying specific areas that they would need to target the population that they serve. The funding and the excess costs that we're having to take out of our general fund could go towards those needs assessments. However, we have our first and foremost obligation of funding special education and the needs that need outweighs at this moment in time due to the lack of funding. Our district alone in the 22-23 school year has covered an excess cost of $10 million from the supplemental general fund to cover required special education items. Out of our 27,000 student population, 15% of our student body receives services under special education, whether it be gifted or under the special education umbrella. Additionally, as we look to serve the individual needs of students, equipment is expensive. We have students who come in with required pieces of equipment that are specialty pieces of equipment that could go up to $8,700 that are required to be able to allow them to access their education. We have an obligation to continue to provide that equipment. However, that is far and few between, and so we have to make sure that we're looking at the masses and the great impact that we can have. The additional item I would say is that when you're impacting your community, serving students and creating an opportunity for inclusive environments, it follows the Kansas vision for education and our ability to create Kansans' employment skills and their fulfillment in the workforce. I want to thank you for listening to my testimony today and for your time for this matter.
Thank you. Our last, well, maybe not last speaker, is Mary Sinclair. Looks like.
Good afternoon. Roads are not as bad as they sound, perhaps. Members of the task force, thank you for being here today. My name is Mary Sinclair, and I am here on behalf of the Kansas PTA. I believe, as most of you know, Kansas PTA is the oldest and largest grassroots parent-teacher advocacy group across the country. And I'm proud to be an active member of the PTA. Today, I just wanted to hit a few notes. You have our testimony in front of you. First, I'd just like to acknowledge that the public school system is the only institution that aspires to prepare every single child in the United States, including nearly 500,000 Kansas kids, for college, career, and civic engagement. No other system aspires to create educational opportunity for every child, regardless of their learning needs. And I think special education is the strongest example of that, established in 1975 with IDEA and the required mandates. And Kansas has added on to those mandates for our students who are gifted. So we've gone above and beyond those federal requirements here in Kansas. The Kansas legislative commitment to the institution is spelled out in our state constitution under Article 6, primarily addressing suitable finance. Kansas has also established a precedent for determining adequate and equitable funding. The State Board of Education establishes the goals and the standards, and a professional cost study is conducted and reviewed by industry-recognized experts, and that cost study then identifies what funding constitutes as suitable. Kansas PTA is not here to refute any opportunity for improvement. However, the PTA does reject the notion that the formulas for identifying the amount of funds needed and for distributing those funds, we refute the idea that those are fatally flawed, and we refute the notion that Kansas PTA that the special education formula is currently fully funded. I'll draw your attention to 40 years of study here in Kansas that has looked at special education dating back to 1983. There are a number of audits and cost studies. The 2018 summary of the LPA audit was that special education funding has been correctly calculated and distributed in the years we reviewed, but the legislature has provided less funding than required by the state. I understand that special education is expensive. I want you all to know, too, that I have been part of Kansas PTA advocates that have gone to Washington, D.C. to advocate from our federal representatives that they also uphold their funding commitment as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And that concludes our speakers. So our agenda was originally scheduled to offer just 10 minutes for discussion. I think that we now have some extra time and certainly plenty to talk about. So I would do this differently at the state board than maybe in this room, but happy to start a conversation around what this group heard as areas of opportunity and keeping an eye to the fact that our responsibility leaving here today is to have a report to send to the legislature and possible recommendations. So if anyone would like to kick us off. Quiet group today. You're deferring to each other. Senator Baumgartner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It wasn't addressed today, but so looking at issues that we did talk about during the 4 days of interim on education. One of those has to do with the distribution of funds to our USDs for special education. And one of the things that did come up is that large lump sum, once the numbers have all been validated, that large sum doesn't go to school districts until October of the following year. Funding for SPED is to be the funding for that current year, and I think that that puts our school districts in a very difficult position. The question was asked of the Department of Education at the time that we had those hearings in the fall about moving the October, that last distribution, sooner into the actual school year. And why was it so late? And we were told, well, that's how it's been done. And that is how it's been done for all these years. So I think that we need to have verification. I've had some conversation with the Kansas treasurer, but I would make a recommendation that that final distribution needs to be made to USDs no later than August 1st, before their actual new school year starts. We've often talked about there are these unencumbered funds that are there for special education. They're not really unencumbered. It's funds they're waiting to receive October the following year of services already rendered. And we already know that in higher education, at least with Senate Bill 155, the Career Tech Ed, community colleges and technical colleges provide those services, but don't get funded or reimbursed until actually the services well after they've been delivered. And there have been many years of shortfalls. Now, we've not had a shortfall of distribution to USDs for that final payment, but I believe it would be appropriate no later than August 1st for the services that were rendered from the year prior. Another thing that came up in those hearings was that we have problems with Medicaid codes. And we know that neighboring states have expanded Medicaid codes so that services, particularly when we're looking at the needs of the 0 to 3-year-olds, that other states are using Medicaid codes that we're not. Now, that doesn't really fall under the purview of the legislature, doesn't follow under the purview of the Department of Education or the State Board of Education, but by golly, we need KDADS and we need KDHE to come together and open up those codes. Why would across the border in Missouri those be opened up, but not for Kansas families and for Kansas school districts? The last recommendation I would make is, we have, at least in Senate Education, every year we have presentations on special education, and we talk about the 3 different ways that districts deliver special education. I know that in the district where I taught, we were a part of a co-op. And so the funding from our school district went to another, and that's where it was dispersed. But the interesting thing is when we talk about special education delivery in the state, it's not the same from district to district. The process is different. We have individual districts providing their in-house. We've got the co-ops. And so I think it's important when we look at actual data, the runs we haven't seen is school districts that are receiving significantly less than. And it's interesting because we had testimony from Gardner Edgerton, and I appreciate that. It's one of the districts in my Senate district. And in talking to the superintendent, Gardner Edgerton receives significantly less than the 92%. So how is it when we're looking at those that receive less than, as well as those that receive more than 100%, what is their delivery? Is there a correlation between within the district delivery of special education, co-ops, whatever it is, but is there a correlation between the school districts that receive more than 100%, those that receive close to the 80 and 90%, and those that are significantly less? Because for us to continue to treat that distribution when the manner of delivery is different for our school districts, not so sure that that's the way we should be handling it, but we don't have that information. I know the Department of Education has the information. I don't know that it's ever been shared with the State Board of Education. I've not seen it with the legislature, but I think that we need to be looking at how that's being done. And I will just make one comment because it hasn't come up at all. And I want folks, as a legislator, I want folks to understand what we are looking at when we're talking about funding schools. And one of the things that we start with is we ask for a run from the Department of Education about what's enrollment. What is enrollment this year? What was it for prior years? And the reason I think that's important is if we just look at the 2022 school year to this current year. So we're just looking at 3 years. This year, last year, the year before. The fact of the matter is that today, this school year, we have 12,897 fewer kids in public schools. So why am I doing the 2-year look back? Because this year, we're funding those kids that no longer occupy any seats in our public schools. Now, we can't really calculate that from a weighting standpoint, but if you just took the 12,897 kids times a base of $5,500, we're talking about more than $70 million that's going to school districts that no longer have those students there. It's going to those school districts, and that's an obligation that we have this year. It's an obligation we're going to have next year. And for those of you that are in growing school districts, which right now actually is a majority of our school districts, Gardner-Edgerton's another one, again, of that growth. Spring Hill. We have school districts throughout the state that are growing. They were harmed by a veto that prohibited them to count this year's enrollment for funding. So when we're looking at solutions, I do urge this committee to make sure that we are looking at funding those schools that are growing with this year's enrollment. Because when we're looking at overall funding for a school district, overall funding for the state, we need to be concerned that we are funding the kids that are there in the seats in our schools today. Because the leaders, the superintendents that have spoken, one that serves on this committee, they had to make hiring for this year. They had to make hiring for this year's needs. We also need to make sure that we come up with a way to address those districts that continue to have declining enrollment. How do we not harm them, but for us to continue to have small county populations with multiple school districts and to continue to fund, almost 13,000 kids that are no longer in schools? We cannot sustain that. So we are going to have to be looking outside the box as to how we maintain education in the state of Kansas. And there was a reference about a new demand because of dyslexia. There is a reason, and I introduced that amendment on the Senate floor, there's a reason that dyslexia does need to be counted as a disability, because from the federal level, they count it as a disability, but our state did not. And even though we've had a dyslexia task force and we have had repeated recommendations on what needs to be done to turn this state around with regard to reading and those that are unable to read, we did take that step to say that if a child is identified as dyslexic, they deserve an IEP. They deserve the services. And our universities are going to have to turn things around, and so that, Madam Chair, is my final recommendation. Because we had a proviso in last year's legislation for funding, and that proviso was that the Department of Education was going to conduct a survey as far as how many school districts were using curriculum and textbooks and delivery that included 3Qing. So that was something that was put into law when the governor signed that funding bill. That was last spring. We are now in January. That survey is yet to be conducted by our school districts. The Department of Education has not surveyed any of our school districts on that. So let me just say, that was a swing and a miss. The legislature understood how important it was, but school districts have not responded because they haven't yet received the survey. So my request is that the Department of Education get that survey out. It's my understanding their timeline is perhaps in February a survey could go out. So that means we're going to get the results about in March or April. As a former classroom teacher, by the time we come back from spring break, that's when state assessments on reading occur. And by April, students feel it's pretty much the end of the year. So shame on us for not having that survey, because one more year of reading instruction was conducted, and we still have no idea how many school districts are using 3Qing and are using that type of curriculum and textbooks within the classroom. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Matthew and Nick, I'm going to put you guys on the spot. What's the best way to go through the process of making recommendations to the legislature? Do we need motions and votes? Is this conversation enough?
That is really up to you, Madam Chair, and the body as to how they want to proceed with recommendations, whether they're going to be accepting all the recommendations that are offered or taking a motion and a second upon each recommendation and then determining whether to put that in the committee report.
Okay. Then I'll ask the body, would you like to vote on each recommendation? Do we want to just do a head nod or a thumbs up with regards to Senator Baumgartner's request? Do we want to go through it line by line? Anyone have an opinion? Would anyone like to reject the request?
Kathy Kirstenbrock-Osmeyer. There's a lot of things that were said. Some of them I feel very strongly would be supported by the group, but there's a few that I'd need clarification on. So probably line by line would be my preference.
In that case, we could start with item 1, which was the distribution of funds to our USDs. Sorry, did you have a question there, or did you just want to vote on it?
Yeah, okay, I'm on. I keep turning off, on, off, on. I think my question on the distribution of funds, a little more information so that I'm really grasping exactly what you're saying on that.
And what the recommendation would be?
And your specific recommendation, yes.
My specific recommendation is that that final distribution, which tends to be the largest distribution, not be in October of the following year, but be no later than August 1st. I'd love to make it July 1, but I'm willing to give a little wiggle room. But what happens is the distribution isn't completed, as we've been told, because districts submit what their costs are, what their head count is, to the Department of Education. All of that has to be verified through a process. I appreciate and respect the process of verification, but to hold a check and to delay a delivery of funds that have already been expended by the district, as far as that catchment going back to them, I think it's waiting too long.
And that is all money that the state has. It isn't waiting on any federal money that has to come in or anything else like that.
Madam Chair, I would refer or defer to either one of our revisors or to John Hess, but it's not been my understanding that it's waiting for federal money.
And I might also put Superintendent Yeager on the spot. Do you have an answer to that question by chance?
My answer is going to be very similar to that answer. I think it's probably based on the second count date for special education. Is that part of it? And the audited numbers for the second count date?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, John Hess, KSDE, yeah, that is part of it because the count date has been in statute at September, or one of the main count date is at September 20th for that. I could, but yes, that is a factor playing into that, and all of that money that is expended is all state appropriations. It's all of the money from the state general fund.
Thank you. Is that helpful? Okay. Do we want to vote on that recommendation? Okay. All in favor of the final distribution to not be the following year but August 1st? Just a vote of aye. Aye. Any noes? Okay, we'll include that one. And then item 2 from Senator Baumgartner was the problems with Medicaid codes. Do you want to word that as needing KDHE and KDADS to come together? How would you like to?
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. The request was made back in the fall when we had our hearings for them to come back with information, and that is part of the frustration. Because at any point in time, feedback could have been provided and it hasn't been. But what we do know is other states have opened up codes and are receiving money, particularly with the 0 to 3-year-olds. And we need to find out what those codes are, and we need to get that process started and rolling.
And is this an appropriate ask of the legislature? That should go to the legislature? Or is there a better way to work that data?
I think it's appropriate for it to come from this committee, this task force, to say this needs to be done, and it gets back to part of what was said by the representative from KNEA. People need to come to the table, and they need to come to the table with solutions. It's not just educators, legislators, and support services. We need the other agencies to be coming to the table and helping with these solutions.
And
Matthew,
I was just going to pipe in to support what Senator Baumgartner was saying. That was a piece of my testimony when we met earlier. And we're licensed just as the same as other therapists when we're talking about related services that are providing services in hospitals and in private clinics, and they are able to bill a far wider range of codes than we are in early intervention. So I think this could be a really important piece to look at, and also flows into 3 to 5-year-old programs and early childhood too. So I'm in big favor of this one.
I guess I would add that just saying the 0 to 3 for the tiny K piece is probably limiting it. It's just like she said, there are other codes in Medicaid going on up through graduating out that I think could be included in that.
Absolutely. I was just using that as an example.
I trust that you guys can wordsmith that. Okay. All in favor of including this request? Ayes? Any opposed? Okay. And then your third item was, we need more data, essentially.
Yes, Madam Chair, and specifically, we know what the data is. At least we can be looking at, we can have a look back of multiple years with regard to what that distribution percentage is. But what we're not seeing is how that correlates with the different ways in which school districts are delivering special education services. So I think I would like to see the data cut up in multiple different ways. It could even include, is there a correlation between whether it's a 1A, 2A, 3A, 4A, 5A, or 6A school district as well? But those are the things we have to look at to identify, are we needing to address needs differently because of the different sizes of our districts, but also because of the different ways in which districts are delivering special education services.
I think that this is an excellent one to have a work group for, where we could have several task force members work together on getting that data and following up so we have that accountability. Who would be interested in working on such a work group? I would. Do we have any other takers? Do three or four people easily? And potentially any other requests for additional data? It's something that we could work through.
I think the idea of having, representatives from different size districts, people that use different models for service delivery, I think is pretty critical to the conversation. One of the things I'm thinking is there are districts, and we heard this morning or earlier from one of our persons that offered testimony, different districts have different service models, and sometimes it's out of necessity, sometimes it's out of choice. So there probably is a lot we could learn through that.
Yeah, I think the studying of that is really important, and having the different individuals, as you said. I come from the rural area of Northwest Kansas with 12,000 square miles to manipulate between all those districts and the numbers, and so economies of scales issues oftentimes come up, and accountability for having service providers that have to drive 2 hours to provide specialized support in a small district. So there's a lot of factors there, and I just want to make sure we have enough people on there to look at the detail.
I imagine that there have been many conversations in your committee meetings, legislative meetings over the past many months where there are requests for more data like this. So I would see this as something that work group could possibly pick up. Would love to have one more member.
Well, I always say yes. I don't know how to say no.
All right, we're up to 3. I'm recruiting now. Okay. Item number 4 that you had was KSDE enrollment data. Certainly that work group can follow up on that. And I think I hit everything. Did I miss anything, Senator Baumgartner? Okay.
Nope, that's it.
Thank you. All right. Representative Nguyen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Referencing the senator, did you include your concern about dyslexia data, or did you not?
I don't think that was included. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's why we have a vice chair.
Yep. We'll make sure that we include the dyslexia data. I have personally seen a lot of new data on SPED in the last presentations in the last calendar year, because of note, the number of SPED students is increasing, and at the same time, our number of gifted students saw a dramatic decrease. And so that's one that I would like to have more information on, is why did we see that decrease? I asked that question, and I think that, and I don't have an answer yet, so I'd like to see that one as well, is why is gifted identification falling at the same time? Are there any other recommendations at this time that we want to make sure go into the report to the legislature?
I have 3 particular recommendations that I'd like to discuss. The first one is that this committee consider adopting the State Board of Education's procedure for addressing funding to the 92% over a next 4-year period. That was unanimously voted on by the State Board on 7/12 of '23. I would like to see that the current funding formula for special education remain in effect until it's really studied, and that perhaps it even wait, and I guess I'd recommend, until you're looking at the full education formula that is due all up to look at in 2027. And then again, that the task force continue to meet to study this over a period of time, much as you had mentioned in your earlier statements, like some of the other task force, so that it's really studied. As just within the conversations here, there's several things that I see differently than probably other people do. And it is, again, looking at all that data and the information and making sure that we're looking at the same kinds of things. There are issues that are also coming up in this next session that I think play into this. The open enrollment piece in terms of special education and transportation considerations based upon that being a related services, whereas a school district 35 miles away may need to have to purchase a special bus or equipment for open enrollment, may affect different costs and funding. So there's just so many issues that are coming up that I think the additional study is real important.
I very much second your comments on the funding formula. I think it's important to note that because we haven't been funding it at 92%, we really don't know what it would look like for districts to receive that 92%. And so it's hard to say that what we're doing right now isn't working, because what we're doing right now isn't fully funded. So I'll take those one at a time. The 4-year phase-in, are there any additional comments on that? Senator Baumgartner?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I think when we talk about let's just accept one thing, we have to look at it in its entirety. So I guess my question would be, would we have consensus to fully fund that, but we're not going to do a 2-year look back and fund students that are no longer in schools? The last update that I just received was if you put in weightings, that means about $107 million that are going to school districts for students that don't exist. That's going SGF. So are we wanting to put funds into SPED, or are we wanting to continue to flood SGF for students that aren't there? And as legislators, we're looking at all of the components of funding. So to say we'll ratchet that up, and also to not have clarification on maintenance of effort, that is another issue that as legislators we can't ignore.
So I hear you on the $72 million. My concern there would be that you're talking about counting individual students versus counting the teachers and other staff that are required to educate those students. And so if I take one student out of a classroom of 22 kids, you're still paying, you still need the teacher. So there's a difference in the way that formula would function. I don't think that it's equitable to say it's $72 million. As you said, there's more to the formula than that. I think that moving ahead with a recommendation to fully fund special ed at 92% of excess costs over 4 years then gets us back to a place where we can start to look at a fully funded formula and a fully funded system and say, is this working? Where do we need to make changes?
Well, I guess my response to that would be what we have as legislators continue to hear. The ask is that the state fully fund to 92%, regardless of what the feds put in. So what's being asked is not only for the state to fund, for state taxpayers to fund, but also to pay for the backfill for what the feds don't fund. And what I'm trying to share is, what would members of this task force be willing to put on the table? So to march forward for a 4-year commitment, are you willing to march away from this ongoing commitment of funding students that aren't in schools? And I know what you're saying. One student not being there is one thing, but again, we're talking about almost 13,000 kids. So in a lot of school districts, it's more than just one student per grade.
Senator Erickson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On one hand, I'm hearing we have an increase in the number of special education students. So my clarification question would be, are we funding the students or the classroom? Because I see an inconsistency there in your response to Senator Baumgartner.
Right now, we're funding the students.
To her point. I do have another question before we take this up for a vote. I appreciated, I think you said something that Superintendent Allen, is that correct? Said in his testimony as well. Let's fund it for these years and see if it works. So my question is, how will we know if it works? What is our measurement to know if it works?
I'm watching your response there. I bet you have an answer.
Did you finish? I don't want to interrupt you. Okay. You know, one of the things that I'm just sitting here thinking about is, you know, this issue and most things connected with education are far and wide. You know, it's almost impossible to sit here and not talk about implications with equipment or dyslexia and many of the things that I think most of us in this room care about in terms of supporting the kids in Kansas. The thing that I continue to sit here and think about, and I think there's been a lot of good questions and conversations about, you know, the current mechanism of is it working or is it not working? And this goes back to something, you know, one of the early people that gave testimony said today is, you know, what districts withholding services. The reality is districts in the state of Kansas are not withholding services. We are providing those services because it's not only our obligation, but it's also the right thing to do for the kids that attend school in our state. The piece where I'm struggling a little bit, and I don't know where the answer is for this exactly, and I really appreciate what feels like a collective commitment to have ongoing conversations, is the fact that one of the things that we're trying to do is we're trying to retain and recruit staff. And we had folks today, many mentioned, you know, the challenges that we're faced with in school districts when we're trying to pay, you know, $15 an hour. And I think we're probably one of the highest in Olathe in the state of Kansas. But the reality is that we have nearly 100 open positions today because we do not have the funds within our general funds to support massive increases over what we've already done in that. And that really is impacting our kids each and every day. It's the same when you look at our service providers. We're losing service providers each and every day, special education service providers every day because they're going to business and industry. That's not unique to us in Olathe, and probably not unique to business and industry as well. But when I look at the amount of money that we transfer, almost $100 million over the last 3 years out of our general fund to special education in Olathe, it's not about having large reserves. It's not those kinds of pieces. Our reserves don't even cover a month's payroll in our district. You know, so there's some very real things that we're trying to figure out in terms of, yes, we're going to continue to support our students who receive special ed supports, but all kids are general ed kids first, and all of our kids deserve the very best and the brightest, not just in our district, but across Kansas. And that's one of the places that we're struggling right now. And, you know, I'm really encouraged by the fact that the meeting is taking place today. I'm hoping there's an opportunity for us to have more in-depth conversation. But the reality is we can cut this 50 different ways and what have you. And, you know, I really thought about the question, Senator, about, you know, what are you willing to put on the table? And the reality is that our general fund dollars, at least in our district, well over 80% is staff costs, benefits, all those kinds of things. So in terms of our general fund, there's not a lot that I'm able to put on the table when I'm looking at our staff who are supporting our kids every day, trying to figure out what is the very best thing we can do for them, because it's tight. And I will tell you, if we had the reserves to make it better ourselves, we would likely be doing that. But, you know, we have fewer students in Olathe this year. We have more students with special education needs in Olathe this year than we did last year. And there's a variety of reasons for that, but all the kids that receive those support, plus the other kids, the other 23,000 kids in our district who are general education students, they all deserve the very deserve the best and the brightest. And that's a part that, from my seat that I sit in, that I'm struggling to figure out, here's exactly what we bring to the table. But I am encouraged by the questions that have been asked today. I don't think there's been bad questions. I like the data that we're looking at. I think there's a lot of data pieces that make sense. But my hope is that we can continue to move forward and have those rich conversations about how we, move together to move forward. The reality is, we're working really hard to try to have the best and brightest in front of our kids every day, all students. So, thank you.
Senator Erickson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate that. But again, I would like to know, because I keep saying, let's go ahead and fund it and see if it works. Again, how will we know it works? Is that in the ability to give raises to is it the number of teachers? Is it in special education student outcomes or general education student outcomes? And I appreciate the clarification, Superintendent, because I've sat here listening to testimony that we are not serving our special education students. And if that's the case, we've got a bigger issue, because that is obviously not the problem. What I'm hearing is we're taking care of special education. We're having to take money from our general fund to do it. So again, I would what are the specific, we always talk about being data-driven. How will we know at the end of 4 or 5 years if this has worked? What's our data point? That's what I'm trying to get to.
And I do want to clarify, we absolutely are supporting our special education students. Many of the experts in the field that spoke today talked about our legal obligation. When an IEP team decides that this is what a student needs, we're legally bound to provide that. Does that mean that special education students wouldn't benefit from additional staff, additional general education programming, and some of those things? Certainly that's possible as well.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry. One of the things I looked at in preparation for this meeting is on the KSDE website. And by the way, the board plan that's 1% of total expenditures. We spend $8.2 billion a year on education in Kansas. That recommended $82 million is 1%. 1%. Which is a lot of money. I'm not saying it isn't, but 1% of of 8.2 billion. So I would like to know again the metrics that we'll use to measure success. But one of the reports I looked at is on KSDE website. It's the IDEA State Performance Plan, and I was curious about this because it has a number of indicators, performance indicators and compliance indicators. And regardless of the percent of excess costs that were funded, to what I could find going back to what's on KSDE website, it goes back, I believe, to 2001 or something like that. Regardless of the percent of excess costs funded, we never hit any of the compliance, never met any of them, which are timely evaluations. That's a no on every report I saw. And so if someone can tell me different. Transition from Part C to Part B, no. Secondary transition, no. And what's interesting is when we did hit some performance indicators, because a lot of those years we didn't hit performance indicators. When we did, we were funded at 82% of excess costs. So my question is, again, what are we going to look to see improvement of outcomes with the State Board of Education's recommended funding? Thank you, Madam Chair.
And I might point to, is Bert still in the room? Because Bert might be a good person to answer this. And he goes back farther than I do. No offense.
On our compliance indicators, we are given a 1% leeway. So as long as we're within the 99th percentile, then we meet requirements. So it may be that we had 2 students out of 5,000 students that didn't meet compliance. So did we hit 100%? No. But did we have a compliant indicator? The answer is yes, because we were within that 1%. And we continue to be within that 1%, and we meet requirements for the last 14 years. Kansas has received, in fact, we had the highest score we've ever had last year of 89.58% out of 100%. Hope that helps.
Senator Erickson, does that answer your question?
Yes, that's very helpful. Thank you so much. And my question would be, that's the public-facing report for lay people like myself. How do we know? Because when we just look and it says yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. I read the footnotes and I didn't see that in the footnotes. So I would appreciate knowing that as a
Perhaps we need to add
primer.
that.
Yeah, I
We
think
need
that
to
would be
add that,
helpful.
and we can do that. I appreciate you pointing that out because I really had no idea that that's what it was reflecting.
Yeah.
Because when we present it to the state board and for our special ed advisory council, we're always very proud that we meet those compliance requirements because the federal government understands that it's almost impossible to hit that 100%. You have 60 days to do an evaluation, school days. Well, there can be a delay of some sort. You have a staffing issue, you have a change of staff, and you miss it by 2 or 3 days, well, you didn't get it. So then they have to do corrective action to tell us, they look at their policies, practices, procedures, tell us what they're going to do to get to 100%. They have 1 year to do the corrective action, and they always do. So yes, I'll look at that and see what we can do to put something on there that explains that.
That would be very helpful because at face value to the average person, you pull up that report and that, what your explanation is not reflected. So
I
thank you.
appreciate that.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Baumgartner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I guess a point of clarification, with ratcheting it up over the course of 4 years, there is no correction for those districts that are receiving significantly less and those that are receiving in excess of the 92%. Is that correct?
If you're basing it on the spreadsheet that was provided that took a formula that was based upon a statewide formula, not up to a district formula, if that's what you're talking about, I think that that's flawed to begin with because the formula of the 92% was based upon an overall statewide approach. And when you take that formula and you plug it into certain districts, it doesn't calculate out the way it seems to by just looking at that paper, because it may show that somebody's getting 121% of their excess cost, and they're not. There's things in each district that make it unique and different. The things that I can think about, just as an example, would be I carry our infant toddler program staff through, so they're getting that categorical money. Another place isn't doing the infant toddler people through them, so that it doesn't show in that calculation. And there's lots of other factors that go beyond my brain and the statistics of that, but that's a concern. The other thing that comes to my mind is that we're looking from the earlier statement, and I may be misunderstanding, because it gets into a lot of details that I don't always deal with. I'm more focused on the special ed. But the funding of the special education is this pot of money. And when you were talking about the overall funding of the students that aren't enrolled, that's a different bucket of money. And so that's where I was getting a little bit confused on some of that. I know in the big picture here, but when you're looking at the formulas and what we're talking about, that's a little different. And then, of course, my mind starts to wander a little bit when we were talking and just listening to Bert and the comments by Senator Erickson about the indicators, because I'm sitting here also looking at the 19 districts that I serve and where we've seen some slippage with indicators in recent years due to the fact that we don't have all the staff, all the paras and the people that we need. So we have seen some slippage in those areas, and I think that correlation might be relevant as well. So I'm thinking of more questions than answers at this point. But I think that the ramping up is a starting point for where we need to be, because I do think we are not funding the special education where we need to be.
One quick clarification I wanted to make too, and I'm sorry I don't recall who made this statement, but it's also really important to note that special education is funded based on our staff members, not student count. I heard that somewhere, and I just wanted to be sure that we were all speaking the same language with that.
I just want to remind that we have some folks in the room who can answer many of the questions that have come up in the committee meetings. So thank you for all that you've added. Do we want to do a vote? Oh, Senator Erickson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And to my previous discussion with Bert, how are we to know that when we get a run from KSDE that shows some districts at 60-something% and some at 300%? How are we to know that? And isn't that something we would want to know? If we're saying 92%, to me, that's an equity issue. And I would just like to know more specifics, because it doesn't, when we ask KSDE for a run by district, and those are the percentages we get, that's what we, look at as legislators. That's the information the department gave us. And when you see some with 300 and something percent and some, you're going, okay, there's a distribution problem. I mean, that's just logical when you look at the runs that we were given. So, why is there such a discrepancy? Is there something that would make those numbers more equitable? And one thing that I've struggled with in looking at this issue is what qualifies as an expenditure? We have some districts counting all kinds of things and other districts not. And it seems to be no consistency. It's whatever a district wants to count as a special education expenditure. And I would just like some clarification on, is there some consistency, with what districts are claiming as an expenditure for excess costs? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Bert, did you want to respond to any of that? You don't have to. I just wanted to give you the opportunity if you've got a short answer. Of course, he got the seat in the far back of the room.
I don't know how I give a short answer to that. I think as I look at that and the way that those formulas are distributed, it depends on how much you pay your teachers, how much you pay your paras, how much your total costs are within your system, because it's calculating the weightings involved that are to be, when you get a weighting for special ed, it's to support the general education staff that are providing supports to special needs students within their classrooms and providing that inclusionary support. So that's where weighting, that's the way it was explained to me, and that's the way that I understood it. So when you take that weighting and you take all of the funds and you look at the excess cost, if I pay $75,000 as my average teacher salary compared to a district that pays $35,000, it's going to look like I'm getting more money because I'm paying such a high salary. So that's where I see the percent showing that jump when I look at those formulas, because I paid $35,000 and Shawnee Mission at one point had $75,000 as an average salary. Well, that makes a huge difference in the way that those percents are going to be calculated. Maybe John or Dale have something they'd like to add from the school finance perspective. I don't think so. So, but that's the way, having done this for like 30-some years, that's the way it was explained to me and the way I understood it, because in my system, we were always under the 100%, but in our calculation, we were providing the special education services based upon the funding we got from the state and the federal government and having to put in the local funds as well. Because it doesn't mean that they aren't putting in the local funds, because you just heard that you're putting in $100 million, is what I heard you say.
Nearly over the past 3 years.
Yeah, so it's an issue of, it's not like they're gaining money and they're getting a bank account filled up with funds. It's how that excess cost formula, I know when Christy was in the room and we were looking at the excess cost formula, it's very complicated, but it's the way it's written into law and that's the way it's computed. And it becomes very difficult to explain it because of the way it's calculated. I believe you have that. I don't know if it was sent out to you or not, but I think you have it.
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The number one difference in the formula is how much per pupil is given to the districts. It's not how much they're paying each of the teachers. The number one thing that determines this number that we're looking at is how much per pupil. Is it 8,000 per pupil? Is it 9,000 per pupil? And what is going to impact that would be all the weightings in that district, average evaluation per pupil. It would also be low enrollment. If I have a low enrollment, every student may count as 2 versus 1. And so that means those districts are getting extra money on the front end for every student. And we also know that special education students are required to be in the least restrictive environment. That means that the majority of them spend the majority of their hours in a regular classroom. The bottom line that has not been addressed in this meeting today is the simple fact that there are billions of dollars, but we are not counting the money. And a clear example of that would be the local option budget money attributable only to special education students, around $166 million, is not being designated for those students. it's free for all. But by the same token, at-risk funds that are attributable to at-risk students are required to go into the at-risk fund. So we have a finance formula that's non-parallel, nonsensical, that doesn't do the things that we need to. And there hasn't been a careful review, but there has been in the legislature of the formula. So I would just challenge anyone that says that the formula does not have flaws to actually sit down and do the math. It's not complicated, tedious, not complicated. And the second thing is there is a difference between what districts are receiving regarding excess costs, and it fundamentally comes down to how much per pupil are they getting for their students, and that's factored by their general education students, and then they multiply it by the number of special education students. That changes everything, and that's why there's a huge difference.
And Senator Baumgartner made the comment earlier about, you mentioned co-ops. So you've got co-ops and interlocals, as well as districts that don't require either of those. And that can also complicate things.
I'm not going to say it's not a complicated formula, because we found through the research with the legislative committee that met with Craig and other team members, it's complicated, but it is the formula that we have, and that's the one that we use.
Thank you, Bert. Senator Erickson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to follow up on Representative Williams' question, if not for those special education students in that district, they wouldn't generate that $160+ million. Is that correct? Okay, so that's correct. Is there any other part of supplemental general aid or LOB that we don't count like that isn't attributable? My understanding is special education is the only one, and no one can give us a good reason why that isn't counted. Am I understanding that correctly? I would just like some clarification.
Is there anyone from KSDE that would be able to speak to that or have an answer?
Madam Chair, Senator, I guess I'm not quite following what you're meaning by attributable to, and this might just be I missed something. So if you could, if you wouldn't mind rephrasing or restating your question.
Representative Williams, maybe I'm not saying it clearly, but is there any other part of the formula that doesn't attribute funds generated for a weighting that doesn't go to that demographic?
And I can add to that. You know that the total foundation aid times the weightings times the FD, that's going to give you a number, and then a percentage, 33% or 30% of that total is your LOB. So there's a percentage of that that's English language learner. There's a percentage that's at risk. There's a percentage that is special education. And so that gives you a number. For special education, it's 166 million. Now there's a percentage of the 500 million for at risk that goes to the LOB. So I think her question is there any other pot of money that goes into LOB that we're not required to use it for what it was attributable for?
Madam Chair, I think I understand. In terms of required transfers from the LOB to the specific funds in which those are deposited, state statute does not require the transfer of special funds generated in the local option budget due to the inclusion of special education funding in the general fund. It does not require the transfer of that money to the special education fund, but school districts are transferring more than that amount from the special education fund, or from the LOB to the special education fund currently. I believe last year it was north of $230 million, something like that. So that is what they transferred last year from the LOBs over. I would have to go back, and there's school district budgets have a lot of different funds with a lot of different requirements to them. I know it was several years ago where the requirement was put in to transfer just the at-risk funds from the general fund to the at-risk fund. So I would need to review all of the statutes some more to give you an answer where I am more comfortable. providing a solid answer.
Senator Erickson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So if I do some quick math then, that changes the amount of, that would change the amount of recommendation if they're transferring 230 million out of the LOB and 166 of that is attributable to SPED, then that would mean a $64 million deficit, correct? Not 82. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I think part of the question that would need to be asked, and I don't have this information, would be the creation of the LOB and the ability to vacillate between 31 and 33% with obviously local approval. What was the intent of that LOB? It may be that we're mixing issues that aren't connected. It may be that we are, but I think we'd want to go back to the original intent of that LOB, what its purpose was to serve local school districts and the students that attend those districts.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Since we weren't all here, when the original funding formula was put together, because this one is pretty much a duplicate of the one prior to that, I would say that we can confidently make the connection that any money that comes into your district, any school district, that's attributable to a certain population should therefore be used for that population because the legislature created that fund with that title. So for me, it's not complicated that if we're going to have at-risk funding, that we want it for above and beyond services, which the legislative post audit just showed, again, after a 2018 audit that said the same, that it is not being used for above and beyond services. And here we have a situation where there is money attributable to special education students. We are not counting any of it. We're not counting the local option budget. That's just one. But what about additional weightings that are attributable to special education students that are not counted? At risk, ELL, transportation, all of those are negated out of the formula. But other things are strangely counted. A virtual number of 12,000 students that throws off the excess cost as well. There is layer after layer after layer of errors in the formula, and that only happens when the formula is updated over a series of years, but not done holistically or comprehensively. And so we can throw more money on it and ignore the fact that the federal government is $300 million short every year. We can ignore the fact that the legislature adds between $30 and sometimes $50 million annually of additional money above and beyond the Gannon decision. Or we can also ignore the fact that every single special education student has money attributable to the fact that they're enrolled in that district, and we count almost none of it. We count their base. We count an average base that eliminates 5 weightings. So there are a lot of flaws, and it does take a little bit of time to understand it. And I am grateful for the legislature that has spent the time. It's very difficult to explain why the money's there. It is up to the districts to decide how it is used.
So what would the ask be from this group at this juncture? What are we looking for on this topic? Is it more information from KSDE? Is it to have an interlocal and a co-op and a few districts come in and present to the task force and explain how they benefit from those arrangements, or how maybe they don't benefit from those arrangements? I mean, administration of funds is going to be more responsible when you're pooling funds. So a co-op is likely to be more efficient. Is that something that would be of interest to the task force? I see a head nod. Yeah? Okay. So it may be that we need to, I would put in, well, we can vote here in a minute. I guess the ask would be to, let's just start with a discussion with an interlocal, a co-op, and local districts on equitable funding. We can leave it kind of open, and then that would give us a place to start the conversation.
I might even add that even interlocals are different. So if you may be an interlocal, but you still may be different in the way you do it, so.
Okay. If there are no changes to that, could I have a vote? I move to add that to the report, so all in favor? Aye. Oh,
Hold
sorry.
on, Madam Chair, thank you. So we're voting on just, because I feel like with all the questions that we have now, just a straight vote on following the state board's recommendation, I think at this time might be a little irresponsible without answers to some of these questions, some clarification. So I like your idea of perhaps meeting again and getting some of that information that's been requested before we take this vote. That would be my recommendation.
We did have a discussion on the table around the full funding the phase-in over 4 years. You're correct. So are you saying that you don't want to take that vote today?
I'm saying I think your suggestion to have a second meeting, get that information would be wise before we vote on this as a recommendation of the task force.
Senator Baumgartner.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I mean, I've listened to State Board of Ed meetings, but I don't recall that any of these types of questions that we've discussed today have come up prior to them, prior to you accepting and making that as a legislative recommendation.
I don't mean to imply that I'm directing the legislature with this one. As Matthew's compiling the report, I was suggesting that it be part of the report that we would like to take a closer look at co-ops and interlocals.
Oh, I understand, but we have the underlying recommendation that we accept
We do.
the state board's position that essentially we ratchet up for 4 years and we stay the course exactly the way it is right now until 2027.
Perhaps the move would be then to revise the recommendation to indicate that this committee is going to further study that information. Isn't that what I just kind of heard we morphed into?
I know what we morphed into.
And I'm good with that, however you make that official. How's that?
I mean, if we're following, would you like to guide us on this? Can you guide us on this?
I think this is the will of the body as to how you're going to proceed. And to you, Madam Chair, I think you determine what to take the vote on and the recommendation to take the vote on, and I think it's the will of the body of what to put in the report as a recommendation.
Do you want to amend your motion, or do you want to leave it as is?
I was a recommendation. I don't know that I said it, this is a motion, but whatever works for this group, I'm willing to amend it to say we want to study and get more out of those answers.
I would just suggest that, using the recommendation as a framework, and then including the further, requesting the task force to consider other aspects. And then even if the next meeting, you bring up other questions, you're in the framework. You have the framework of the state board recommendation.
So just a quick point of clarification about this. If our report goes to the legislature, and one of the things that we'd like for consideration in our report is for this group to continue to get back together and study it, does that take legislative approval?
That's a good question. The statute for this committee does say that the task force can meet at any time and any place within the state upon the call of the chairperson. Now, this task force was granted 1 day to meet by the LCC, I believe, and then meetings during the legislative session for task forces like this. I'd have to look into how that would work with whether it needs some LCC approval for payment of per diem and expenses like that. But yeah, I'd have to kind of look into that further.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I would also note that we could save the taxpayers a lot of money if we actually look at the data that has already been collected and the answers that have already been collected on this subject. We have looked at the interlocals. We have looked at the co-ops. There are 45,000 students that basically just directly receive services from their main district. There are others that it's just a smaller amount of numbers. So we have already waded through each and every one of these questions, both in the legislature in at least the past 2 years. So it would save a lot of members a lot of time and taxpayers a lot of money if each person would go research what has already been discussed in open hearings. So that I would offer as an opportunity rather than research, pull up what has already been provided and testimony has already been submitted. Thank you.
Respectfully, I've heard at least one comment today that was construed in a way that I would say was not quite accurate. So if I were going to go back and watch a committee meeting and pull data from that meeting, I would also want to have the time to kind of trust but verify that the way that it was presented in the committee is in fact backed up with data. So I think that's the advantage of having a working group that would go.
I would like to add too that I think if you go back and review that data and watch previous hearings, you would see that there's a lot of disagreement over the data and the way that it is compiled and disaggregated. So I think that this committee would first have to come to an agreement on how that data is going to be compiled and disaggregated before we can take a look at it to even come to any conclusions or recommendations.
So back on the motion, your amended motion. Are we ready to vote? All in favor of the motion on the table, say aye. Aye. Oh,
Sorry. Would you say what the motion on the table is one more time? I'm sorry. Just want to make sure I'm clear on that.
it's what Kathy said last time.
Well, it's morphed through various task force members, and this can certainly be adjusted as necessary. But where I'm kind of sitting now is there's a motion on the table to recommend the state board's plan for the infusion of funding with the notion that continued study will be done by the task force. And if that's not what this motion is, the task force should be clear that of what they're voting on and change it as necessary.
Any changes to the motion as Nick read it? All in favor? Aye. Aye. Opposed? No. I think the ayes have it.
Division.
Okay. How do you do this here? Do you raise your hand? All right. All in favor, raise your hand. Opposed? You got that? Okay. So that was a 6-4, sorry, yeah, 6-4 vote. Motion passes. And then your second item, you said the current.
The current funding formula remain in effect, and preferably until the whole education budget's looked at as a unit in, I believe it's 2027, when that comes due. So I'm saying that, right now we have a motion to move forward, but certainly to continue to study this as part of the bigger picture as was mentioned.
Any discussion? All right. Do we have a second? I guess do we have a second for that motion?
I'll second.
We hadn't been, but we'll move to that. All right. All in favor? Just go ahead and vote with our hands. All right. To maintain to keep the current funding formula as it is. 1, 2, 3, 4. Opposed? 1, 2, 3, 4. Abstain? And an abstention. So I've got 4, 4, and an abstention. Motion fails. All right. And item number 3, that the task force continue to meet. And it sounds like there are some interesting rules around that. I would ask if the working group, so if you don't have a quorum for the task force, but you have a working group, it wouldn't have to be a public meeting. They wouldn't have to travel. Is that something that is workable? And wouldn't necessarily have to be funded if the members were amenable to that.
That's a good point. The Kansas Open Meetings Act does specifically state that subordinate bodies of a public body are subject to the Kansas Open Meetings Act. So if there is a subordinate body that this task force creates, you need to be cognizant that COMA does and likely does apply.
So to further clarify there, the challenge would be that we would need to have staff available to help get that meeting online, streamed on the YouTube channel, et cetera. Okay.
The meeting just needs to, it just needs to comply with the requirements of COMA. The online video streaming is not part of the COMA law, but notice of the meeting and the public nature of the meeting and the meeting being public are the main points to COMA that need to be considered.
A few questions just to clarify, because we're kind of all over the place. But right now, we're focusing on a report that needs to be made to the legislature next week. And so, we don't have much time today to do all of this in detail. So we're making recommendations to the legislature. But if we continue to meet, we could continue to advise or make recommendations. There's no prohibition of any changes or anything down the road. So right now, we're just making recommendations for the initial report that we must make next week, correct?
Correct.
Thank you.
Do we want to return to the task force meeting again? Do we feel that that's something that we want to put in the recommendation to the legislature? I have a head nod. Anyone else interested in recommending to the legislature that this group continue to meet? Okay. Ready to vote? All in favor? Okay. All in favor of continuing to meet? 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8. Okay. Opposed? I've got 8 and no opposition. So motion passes. All right, that was the last verbal that I had for recommendations to the legislature. Are there any other items that members would like to have included in the report specifically, in addition to all of the written testimony that's been submitted and our speakers today? All right. Matthew.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Since it does look like there are no new recommendations, I was just wanting to kind of run down what I have to make sure that outside of some wordsmithing that I've not missed anything or grossly misrepresented anything. So I have that the task force has adopted the recommendation that the first distribution of special education state aid to school districts be made no later than August 1st of the fiscal year. I have that the committee recommends that KDHE and KDADS work to increase codes available to school districts and other educational organizations for utilizing Medicaid to fund eligible special education services, specifically, or I should say especially for 0 to 3 years old. I have a recommendation to look at how distribution of special education funds is done and whether elements of size, services rendered, or other factors are causing some districts to be funded at different levels. I have a recommendation for KSDE to get the survey out regarding the 3Q system quickly. And then the recommendation for adopting the state board's recommendation regarding an increase of special education funding, along with the task force having further discussions with interlocal co-op and other districts regarding equitable special education funds and further consider additional aspect or elements, and then the final one of recommending that the task force continue to meet to further study the issues surrounding special education and related services. Do those represent kind of everyone's understanding?
Senator Baumgartner?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Matthew. I think the portion where you said especially 0 to 3, it should be including 0 to 3.
Perfect. I'll make that adjustment. Thank you.
Any other adjustments? Okay, that sounds great. Thank you, Matthew. All right, with that, since we can call the next meeting at the call of the chair, I don't think that we need to set that now. So if there's no further business, going once, going twice, we are adjourned.